Tonight, we're going to be looking at the Gospel of Matthew. I've been looking at some art. This is some bronze piece and a piece of statuary just showing Matthew. And once again, you notice a little angel, always angels around Matthew because the angels whispered into his ear what to write down. So tonight, here's where we are. This is already the fifth of our 6 sessions. My goodness, it's been a quick winter, seems like to me. So this is our 5th, next to last. Our penultimate, there's our memory word for tonight, session. March the 8th, chapter 18 tonight, the 4th of 5 sections that the Gospel of Matthew organizes the teachings and sayings of Jesus, each of which end with this little refrain, and when Jesus finished saying these things, then whatever happened next. That's going to be at the end of chapter 18 as well. And tonight, they're all focused on how to behave in church. What does it mean to be in the church? And in fact, one of the things that's unusual about this, in this chapter, the actual word church is used. And at the time when Jesus was teaching, there wasn't any church yet. I mean, we, the church, are the continuation of his life and ministry and work. But Matthew, of course, very much knows about a church. And so whether Jesus actually used the word church and people are scratching their heads saying, I wonder what that is, or Matthew's kind of looking back and Jesus is talking about the community, the gathered community, don't know. But actually the word church is going to be used here. When there's problems in the church, he'll say, bring the church involved. Jesus actually uses that word here in our text that we'll have. So churches are families. Again, we were not called to serve God by ourselves. There are no lone rangers in Christian work. We, in fact, find our purpose. We, like pebbles that maybe rub the rough edges off of each other in a pocket or in a stream, we're designed to help and encourage and sharpen each other and call each other to accountability for that matter too, and just lift each other up. We're not designed to be alone, which is what makes this COVID pandemic so terrible for so many people. If you've been able to get out and about or Zoom, that certainly helps, but one of the great tragedies of this are people in hospitals, say, when they're cut off from the people who would be their primary support, or the elderly who are in nursing homes and other places like that where they're just having a lot of isolation. We're just not designed to be alone. Even when God created the first human, he said it's not good. It's the first thing that God said wasn't good, because everything was, oh, that's good, that's good, that's good, right? In Genesis 1, the first time God said that's not good is it's not good for the man to be alone. And I don't know if women can be alone, but I know men can't be alone, that's for sure. And so from the very beginning, we're put into relationships, into context. So families, and in the 1950s and 60s, this is what families look like. You probably recognize most of these, Brady Bunch. Now there's a blended family. Anybody ever been in a blended family? It's not near as easy as the Brady Bunch, is it? That made that look so simple, right? The only thing that you know less about being a parent is being a step-parent. Anyway, that's a blended family. There's the Waltons there. Everybody's just like the Waltons, right? Yeah. Fathers Knows Best over here. That was the 50s or 60s. When was that? I want to say it was 50s? Okay, before they were in color. The Jetsons up there on the far right, I guess the 2100s or something, but ideal little family. The Partridge Family, they even all sang and harmonized together. And many times we watched those shows and perhaps we scratched our heads and said, why can't we be like that, right? Where father always knows best, or where everybody seems to behave, and but instead, these are our families. And so in the 70s and 80s and later, family shows began to depict the more dark undersides of families. So All in the Family, remember Archie, just, what a guy. But that was not a Father Knows Best show. Today, even a current series that's on, The Modern Family. Anybody seen that show? It's a kind of extended family, but there's all kind of, let's just say, variety in that particular family. The Addams Family, of course, a takeoff on that whole dark-sided kind of thing, and that may see, or the Simpsons up there. And many of us look at those shows, and we find ourselves thinking, now there's a family I can relate to. All right, there's more like the family I know. And because families can be struggles, some siblings can argue, and kids can be difficult. Irma Bombeck, the humorist, once said that every child threatens to run away from home. She said it's sometimes the only thing that keeps a mom going. So the truth is, in our relationships, even in our own families can be tough, right? They can be difficult. And so that's kind of the way those can be. Well, sometimes what happens in families is we learn how to share. Some of you have a sibling. How many of you wish you didn't have a sibling? So whether you're the oldest or the youngest or the one lost in the middle, I'm in a big family, and I was the middle one, and, never on the refrigerator. But families have to learn how they got to share the world. And if you were an only child, you still figured that out at some point, probably. You went to school or something. And so families, after a while, not only learn how to share, they learn how to fight. And fights go along with families. And fights go along with church families, too. Ever been in a church family fight? Ever been to a business meeting that you thought, wow, sheesh. Whole denominations sometimes split. I say sometimes, every one of them is split over time. So, we just can't get our own act together. And sometimes it's humorous. My favorite one really was a story that I heard was a little tiny church and kind of two main families that ran things, and they were trying to decide, they had to put a new roof on the church, and one family thought it should be a brown roof, the other thought it should be a black roof, and they just could not agree, would not agree. And so finally they made one half of the roof brown and the other half of the roof black. And the family that voted for the brown, even though they couldn't see it, they always sat under that part of the roof. And the family that voted black sat under that part of the roof, and the aisle was like a big aisle separating them. And the sad part about that, it was called Unity Church. The sad thing about that is everybody in the whole community, they were in effect advertising like on a marquee, we can't get along. Because they became sort of a laughing stock because everybody looked at this weird colored roof and everybody knew the story. When I was a kid growing up, all the churches were small out there. Usually had a church kind of within just a donkey ride from wherever you lived. But I remember one church was New Harmony, and it was New Harmony number 1, and about a mile away was New Harmony number 2. And I don't even have to know the story, but I know the story. They had some trouble being in harmony with each other, and they split, and so it was number 1, number 2. So sometimes churches fight. And what do we do? What do we do when we fight, when we struggle, when we're not perfect, when we're not the ways we would like to be? And it hurts us and it embarrasses us. But again, the truth is the church is made up of people like us. So one of the fights or the struggles that Jesus will address in chapter 18 of the Gospel of Matthew starts with this question. In fact, before we do that, what all of these characters on this screen have in common? They're competitive, okay? They're what? They're superstars, okay? Muhammad Ali called himself the greatest. Wayne Gretzky, the great one. In the case of Brady or Nicholas or Serena Williams, they're currently called the GOATs, which means what? Greatest of all time. Until someone wins more of whatever, they're the greatest of all time. And these are considered really the epitome of what it means to get to the very top of the heap. Who is the greatest? Well, that's if the disciples were doing this, and if I had a picture of him, I don't have a picture of him, but if I could put Simon Peter's picture up there, he wants to be on that slide right there. Now, if you looked in chapter, if you got a real Bible, in fact you do, you have Bibles in front of you. If you look in chapter 17, right before the chapter we're looking at tonight, there's some people who came up to Simon Peter, actually some tax collectors, came up to Simon Peter and said, does your master pay the temple tax? And Peter said, well, yeah, sure he does. Then he went and asked Jesus, do we pay the temple tax? And Jesus said, oh, here, let me go catch a fish. Actually, unlike the way Peter normally caught fish with a net as a fisherman, Jesus said, take a hook in order to get a single fish. The first fish you bring up, in its mouth is going to be a coin, and it's worth double the amount of the tax. Pay for me and for you too. Interesting, by the way, Simon Peter's a fisherman. Jesus called him to be a fisherman. In the Gospels, nobody ever catches a fish without a direct help from Jesus. If you've ever tried to catch fish, you know it takes some divine help also. But this is another one of those examples. But the point is, a chapter before that, Jesus has said, who do people say that I am? Who do you say that I am? If Simon Peter shot his hand up, you're the Christ, the Son of the living God. Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah. Flesh and blood hasn't given you this. My Father in heaven has given this to you. And now you shall be called Peter, rock. And on this rock I will build my church, and I will give you the keys to the kingdom of heaven, right? Remember that? So, okay, that's great if you're Peter, but what about the other guys listening to that? I knew the answer too, Jesus, right? And then a chapter later, even these tax collectors assume Peter is the spokesperson for the group. So there was a frequent argument among the disciples about which one of them. I knew they were the 12, but within the 12, who's the best of the 12? And Jesus himself would occasionally take Peter, James, and John, those three, and say, guys, why don't you go with me a little further? Up on the Mount of Transfiguration, the other 9 had to stay at the bottom. Those 3 got to go further. In the Garden of Gethsemane, they're all praying, but those 3 got to go a little further, and then he went on even further by himself. But you could argue, it sure looks like Peter, James, and John are kind of the teacher's pets, right? And even among Peter, James, and John, it sure looks like, at least based on his own self-designation, Peter seems to be the leader. Well, all the disciples were prone to argue among themselves, which one of us is really the best? Who's the greatest? And it comes out in all different kinds of ways. Sometimes they just come right out and ask Jesus. In the case of, in Matthew's gospel in chapter 20, the mother of James and John come up to Jesus with James and John in tow and says, Master, would you put my 2 boys on your right and left hand? In other words, and scoot Peter over. And probably what mom maybe doesn't want her kids to really succeed. But this argument about who's the greatest, and the sad thing is in the Gospel of Matthew, that argument always comes right after, this is the sad irony, right after Jesus has just finished predicting his own death and taking up your cross. And here's where we're going, boys. And it's going to be scourging, and it's going to be death, and take up your cross. And talk about missing it totally. Okay, yeah, we got that. But which one of us is the greatest? Takes a lot of patience to be a Messiah, I'm sure. So they're arguing about which one can be the greatest. And Jesus says in chapter 18 then, all right, if you want to know what's about being great. And so he sets a child in front of them. These little ones is the first part of chapter 18. And you know, little ones, here's just some pictures of little baby animals. And aren't they darling? I mean, you just want to say, "Aw," right? I mean, we're just suckers for little kittens and puppies, and I mean, even a pig and a possum look cute when they're babies, right? There's nothing quite like a little one. How much more so if it's a child, right? Aw, right? I mean, these kids are adorable, and that little angel there in the middle just want to take her home. But I mean, how beautiful are children? Of course. Jesus says, you want to be great? Be like this. Not childish, childlike. Children aren't perfect. Our grandchildren are, but our children were not. But Jesus isn't a hopeless romantic about children, but children are little ones. They don't have an illusion of being the greatest. They're not the biggest or tallest or strongest things around them. They're the smallest among them. They can't reach things. They have to get permission. They're told what to do. And so however rambunctious they might be, little imps they might be, the truth is they're just not in charge, and they don't think that they are until they become teenagers. But at this age at least, there's an innocence to it. And don't you remember when your kids were that age? Can you see your children up there? Remember watching them sleep? And even now, maybe it's grandchildren or just anybody else's child. If you don't have a child, go borrow a child and, get permission first. But, there's something about being around a child. They're just lovely. And Jesus says, you want to be great? Be like this. Don't be posturing all the time. Don't be planning and scheming. Don't be in competition thinking that your greatness has to come at the expense of somebody else. That's the way the world thinks. And children don't think like that. And my children aren't going to think like that either. Now, we keep being drawn back into it, though, don't we? I mean, the book of James says, where do your fights and arguments come from? Where does it even come from? He says, it's because your desires are warring. You want and you can't have, so you take. Your anger gets out of control, so that wicked side of us, and James is talking to a church too, that side of us that just has so much trouble being childlike keeps coming back to us. It's weeds in our garden. And Jesus says, do better. He says, these little children, not only should you be like them, that is humble and gracious and innocent and dependent. But also, be careful about how you treat the little ones. Now, that certainly means how you treat children. But actually, it means who else might the little ones be? The little ones are anybody who's vulnerable, anybody who's marginalized, anybody who's on the edge, anybody who's most at risk in any community. Dwight David Eisenhower, when he was president, said the mark of the greatness of a country is how well it takes care of its most vulnerable citizens. It's hard for us to live into that dream, isn't it? But I think he's right. But certainly he's echoing what our Lord is saying. The mark of the church is make sure you have an eye for the one who you'd be easy to overlook, that you have a heart for the one who probably can't do anything for you, that you do not get so caught up in being an insider that you fall out of love with whoever's on the outside wishing they could be inside. These are the little ones. Pastor Sue mentioned even yesterday in church, the least and the last and the lost. I can remember see his hand still doing that. Who are the least, last, and lost in any church's sphere of influence? These are the little ones. And Jesus said, boy, I tell you, don't you put a stumbling block in front of them. They're already, they're just starting out to walk anyway. Don't even make it harder for them. And sometimes this can be physical. Someone may be having trouble gaining entrance or access. They can't get parking. I love to see a church that says this parking is for those with mobility challenges, or this area of parking is for moms with young children. They got all that equipment for them, or this is for newcomers even. The problem there is they don't know their way around, and they didn't know to come 30 minutes early. So a church that is kind of mindful of who's most at risk of not making their way into our body. Sometimes it's a feeling of, sometimes people bounce off the church because they just feel like they've been stiff-armed a little bit. They feel judged. They just don't know if they'd be accepted. So the church has to have room on its dance card, so to speak, to always be looking for who else can we include. And sometimes the longer we're in the church, the more we get so caught up with each other, there's not really any room for anybody else to join us. We don't mean to be that way, but if you're on the outside, it can feel that way. Who might it be? This is the prayer, is help us have it. Lord, help me to be aware of not only when I might be a stumbling block, but who's just having to navigate stumbling blocks to make their way here. And help what I say and what I do and how I act to incarnate your enormous desire to keep sweeping everybody toward the center. Be careful of stumbling blocks. So I love this little picture with the concrete block that would be easy to trip over. You ever been just out on a walk and you were looking up at heaven or whatever and didn't see the little crack in the sidewalk and went splat, right? So sometimes a little cartoon over here, you wouldn't be able to read it, but the cartoon on the right said, aside from a few minor stumbling blocks which made vacuuming difficult, the project was going well. And so stumbling blocks, whatever it is that makes us stumble, and it's not. So Jesus said, be careful. Don't put anything as a hindrance. He would say once, it was actually children once, they were trying to bring children to him that he might touch them and bless them. And his own disciples were saying, he ain't got time for this. The Messiah's busy. And besides, we're on his right and left hand anyway, get these kids away. But we ain't got time. This is not a children's show here. And they were, in fact, becoming a stumbling block. And what did Jesus say? Do not forbid the children. Don't let there be anything that blocks the children from getting to me. He was very serious. Be careful about the children. If you mess this up, if you need something even more stern, he says, and Matthew doesn't miss many chances to, I call it, this whole thing here has been called a gospel for a church in a sophomore slump. I think Matthew's church has kind of gone to sleep at the wheel a little bit. So Matthew remembers things Jesus said that kind of slap us awake a little bit. Here was one. If you cause one of these little ones to stumble, it'd be better for you. It'd be better if you had a millstone tied around your neck and thrown into the ocean to drown, which is a pretty terrible way to die. It sounds like a mafia hit, doesn't it, right? What's a millstone? Since we tend to get our bread at the grocery store and it's already been milled, but in those days, Jesus would have been talking to people who knew absolutely what that was. It's a stone that's not quite round, it has an angle actually, so that when you push it, it sort of goes around the circle on its own. But here's the big stone here, and then a grinder on top, and you put the grain in there, and obviously it crushes it, as you roll that wheel around. And sometimes the wheel was so large that actually couldn't be pushed by a human being. It had to be pushed by some kind of animal, like, say, the donkey there. And the word that Jesus uses in Matthew 18 is actually, the millstone is actually a donkey stone. So he's probably imagining one large enough that probably it took an animal to push that thing around. So this is no small stone that he was putting around. They said, better for you to be having that large stone put around your neck, thrown into the ocean. Better to do that. Better to face that terrible death than to face the anger of a God who really, really, even if we don't see them, God never takes his eyes off of the little ones. In fact, he'll go on to say, if you're reading as I'm going, he said the angels in heaven, it's kind of an angel assigned to each one of those little ones. And the angels are always face to face with God, kind of advocating for that little one. So you mess with the little ones, there's going to be a direct report of this to God. But yeah, that'll slap you awake a little bit, won't it? Then he says, continuing almost on this little one's theme, he says then, so imagine a shepherd, and this wasn't hard for him to do. Imagine a shepherd that had 100 sheep. By the way, this would be a pretty middle-class shepherd. It was not at all uncommon for a shepherd to have like 4 or maybe 8. 100 is kind of a rancher almost. So this guy, he's got 100 sheep, and they're out there. They're not fenced in, so they're out there in the wild. If you've ever been to that part of the world, the sheep are just because they don't roam very far. They're not really runaway kind of animals. They like to stay herded up pretty much. Sheep can't see very well, and they cannot hear very well. So the way they know they sort of stay in, the way they send out little sonar readings is they try to make sure they can stay in sight of each other. And if they can't for sure do that, they at least set out a little bleat. But of course, a lamb doesn't roar. It's not a real loud sound it makes. Lambs, everything is kind of diminutive on lambs. So if they can't hear any response to their bleating, then they're really lost. If they can't see, if they get out of sight and out of earshot, they're lost. And then they have, then they don't know what to do. They just advertise, wolf, come get me. So imagine a shepherd who has 100 sheep and one of them got lost. He's just got his head down in the grass or asleep or whatever and just got out of earshot and eyeshot. And what does the shepherd do? And if this would have been common, seems like bad business, doesn't it? But this would have been common. The shepherd, because even if you had 100, the shepherd tended to really know their sheep. Might have had names for them. They don't just count them. They know who they are. Jesus, remember, talked about, I am the good shepherd. I know my sheep. I can call them by name. He uses that image in the Gospel of John. So what shepherd would not leave the 99, who kind of all were staying, paying attention to each other? He'd leave the 99 without an underling or anything and go try to find that one lost sheep. And when I was a kid, I remember in church we had these stained glass windows in one of the churches where in our growing up. And one of the pictures was Jesus having this little tiny lamb over his shoulder. And as an 8-year-old boy, that was just very comforting to me. I'm sure I was supposed to be listening to the sermon, but what I was listening to was the sermon in that stained glass window. And it's always been an important image for me to imagine the Lord being like that. To leave the 99, go after the one. In the church where Connie and I are members in the up north in Dallas, around the edges of the sanctuary is a scripture verse written out, and I guess it's some kind of mosaic, it's way up there, but it completely covers the circumference of the sanctuary, and it's this text. It's about the shepherd leaving the 99 and going out and finding the one. And when they find the one, their joy is so great that it creates great joy in all of heaven when even one person is found. That's the text. And so sometimes when I'm also not listening to the sermon there, that's what I'm looking at. You can tell what kind of guy I am in church, which is probably why God called me to preach, because I wouldn't pay attention otherwise. But I love this image of leaving the 99. But again, from a business perspective, it doesn't seem very smart. The shepherd could get back and 10 more might have been gone, or a wolf may have come in. But that's kind of missing the point. The point, of course, is not why does he care for the one more than the 99, the one who messed up in the first place. Why does the shepherd, if it wasn't good business sense, why not just reward the good 99 with being there for them? If the dumb sheep can't stay up, then just too bad for him. Well, it does seem crazy. Leaving the 99 seems crazy unless you're the one. So it really depends on how you hear that story. And I guess much of the time we're the 99. right? I mean, we're here on a Monday night. Goodness, if that's not a 99, who could be, right? But we must never, ever forget that all of us had a time when we were the one, right? God had just come scoop us up. We don't use the word lost sometimes like people once did, but we've all been lost before. And my guess would be, you could remember some times you've kind of drifted off the path and been lost even since then. Anybody ever had Jesus rescue a couple of times? Aren't you glad that we have a Lord who's always again got an eye to who's on the edge, who's headed the wrong way, even if they messed up, even if it was their fault, probably was. Or they just distracted, or they got lazy, or they got hurt and out of the routine, whatever it was. We have a Lord who just keeps on, and not only is God patient, he doesn't then beat up on the sheep the whole time. What kind of sheep, dumb lamb you are, you're going to be my next lamb chop. It's not like he does it in order to beat up on him. And nor can the lamb on the shoulder of the shepherd come back and say, look how much the master loves me. You 99, look how much. No, there's a sense of enormous gratitude to be restored to the family. And this is where he's going to pick up for the rest of our chapters, how important it is that we share or echo our Lord's joy when he found the one and when the one was restored to the flock. Restoration to the flock is now going to be the hinge pin between this parable of the going out, finding the one, and where he's going to go next about how do we restore our relationships. And so he starts out with this. If someone sins against, or even someone in the church, it even says, most of the text will say, if your brother, this applies to sisters also, though, by the way. Oops, wrong place. Matthew chapter 18. Verse 15, if your brother sins against you, go and show him his fault, just between the two of you. If he listens to you, you've won your brother back. But if he will not listen, take one or two others along, so that every matter may be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. If he refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And if he refuses to listen even to the church, treat him as you would a pagan or a tax collector. So, a couple things here. One is, it's obvious that even in the church, someone's going to sin against you or offend you. Some brother or sister in the family of faith is going to pull on your pigtails or pinch you. How do you fight with your siblings? Okay, I wish we had time to all share it because I'd love to use it against you. But can you bring back the times when you chase each other with scissors or whatever else that you did, snuck in and trimmed their hair in their sleep? I don't know what you did, but think of the ways that we fought as kids. But there'll be times when in the church, adult children, even who belong and call Jesus Lord, are gonna hurt each other. They're gonna offend each other. They're gonna bruise each other. So Jesus is being realistic here. And if we think, why can't we be just like the early church? Well, this is the early church he's talking to. Paul talks to the church at Philippi. That's a great, sweet letter. But including in his letter to Philippi, he addresses 2 women and says, would you all just please get along? Having you the mind that Christ had. So and they were both church leaders. And so sometimes even in the early church, they bumped into each other. Paul and Barnabas, remember, had these great words against each other. So you're going to have it happen. But here's a couple of wisdom things I think we can take with us. In case you're ever in a church, that is, if you leave this one and go to some other church, this might happen to you. It will never happen here, where never is heard a discouraging word. But in case you ever find yourself bruised by a brother or sister in the faith, there's some good wisdom for us. And it's good wisdom about how to repair any kind of relationships. Because again, the point is, how can we get all 100 sheep back in the flock? How do we get everybody back? It matters. So here's the thing. Someone offends or sins against you, Jesus says, you go to them. Now, right off the bat, that's where most of us mess up. Because if I've been sinned against, I want to wait for you to come to me. In fact, you need to be crawling on your knees, and I need to see blood on your knees, and you've got to apologize, and I've got to determine whether I think you're being apologetic enough, and then you've got to atone for it, and then you've got to listen to me give you a sermon about it, and then maybe If you do enough good things, and if I just wear myself out, then maybe I'll forgive you, right? That's the way we just think, why do I have to go to them? They're the ones who were wrong, right? They should come and apologize. They should be approaching me. How many times have you had relationships that have stayed in permanent cold freeze or lost, or certainly the hurt lasted way too long because no one would make the first move? And Jesus is saying, you know who's supposed to make the first move? You who are hurt. Now that seems odd to us. Why would that be? Because I'm going to work from the assumption Jesus is smart about this, which is always vote with Jesus, you'll win. What's going on? Why should the offended one make the first move? What's that? That's right, exactly, Lynn. It may well be that the person who offended you doesn't know they offended you, right? Have you ever had anybody who let you know that 20 years ago you hurt their feelings and you had no idea? Has that ever happened to you? And you said, really? I didn't know. And so you're there holding a grudge against them, up all night, hating them, thinking about how that your hatred in some ways or your grudge is a way of punishing them. But you know what? They're sleeping all the way through the night. And not because they're cold-hearted and callous. Maybe they just had no idea. Now they still may have been at fault, but they just didn't know. The person who cut you off in traffic, maybe they're an idiot driver, but maybe they really didn't see you. Maybe they were just, I don't know, changing the radio. But you take the initiative. If you've been hurt, you have to take the initiative. Second thing he says, you go directly to them. Here's another place that we tend to go off the rails. First, we go to all of our friends and say what all they did to us, right? We want to get validation, which also they deserve being run down a little bit, right? We owe that to them for them to suffer publicly for their private humiliation of us. And so we kind of go around, and they're the last person we tell. If we tell anybody, we take initiative talking to all the wrong people. Jesus said, no. Go to them directly. Confront. The word confront means get face to face, front to front with each other. Confront doesn't mean that that, but get face to face with each other. Go directly to them. Speak face to face, not in writing. These days, a lot of communication is done by text, right? Like this little thing, this is a breakup where someone says, hey, I don't think this is going to work. I'm breaking up with you. Sorry. The other person says, whatever. You'll never find someone like me. And the person says, yeah, that's exactly the point. But the point is, it is not going to somebody by sending them a text, even if you have a lot of emojis and all caps, right? That's not the same. It means actually face-to-face. And why is face-to-face better than even in print? There's dialogue. You learn so much more. Have you ever tried to tell a joke to someone in print and then it didn't come across at all? Because what they couldn't get was the wink in your eye. They couldn't get the turn of phrase that made it the kind of the wink in your voice. And suddenly the whole thing was lost, right? And sometimes you just have to write emails and things. I get it. But if you've got some pretty heavy freight to carry, like, hey, we need to work out something between us, you're never going to be able to get to that unless you're able to take in the entirety of the person's body language and their tone of voice and all of that. There's nothing like face-to-face, and if you don't have that, at least Zoom. But being able to capture more of the ways we communicate, because we communicate with a whole lot more than just our words. Get face-to-face with somebody and speak to them, but it also doesn't mean lash them, but it's letting them know and sort of own, this is how I'm feeling, and this is what hurt, and it's just like you. You're always that way, not that, but this is how I'm feeling. And I need you to know, because I care enough about you and I believe you care enough about me. I can't believe this is the way we want to be, but you get directly with them. You go in private, so you don't call them, you don't do this in the restaurant. You don't do that in the context of the Thanksgiving family meal. It's obviously one-on-one with them, because you're limiting the damage, not broadening the damage, right? My goodness, why can't we learn these things? And what's the whole point of all this? The point of all this is that we might be restored to each other. Jesus says, if you'll do this. In fact, I wonder what high percentage of our lifelong hurts in marriages or siblings or churches, I bet a very high percentage could be cured, resolved, and redeemed if we did these things quickly and directly and lovingly and honestly, and if Jesus said, what you get back? You get your brother or sister back. And if you don't, that's too much to lose. Because I've placed you in family. It's the only chance you've got. You need each other. You really do. Imperfect as you all are, you're going to need each other. So you get your brother or your sister back. So that's the first step. But Jesus is a realist. It doesn't always work that way, right? Somebody might say, too bad. Sorry you feel that way, but it was your fault. You started it or whatever. They might just go off the rail in all kind of ways. It may not lead to redemption. But the point is, Jesus says they are so important and your relationship is so important, you don't give up easy. You don't say, all right, well, that's it. You keep pressing. You take another step. Now, in this case, the step is not going to all caps in your text. The step here is call in a third party. I think the spirit of this is, it's not like, okay, now I get a tribunal and 3 of us are going to gang up on you. It's not that. Now you got to face my committee. It's rather when you're stuck in any relationship, in a home, in a church, whatever, when you're stuck and you couldn't really just simply work it out in just a direct, honest conversation, if you're stuck, call in some help. What is a marriage counselor? What is that? Do they have magic words? Are they the person who breaks the tie vote? No. It's an objective person who's not personally hurt, because the personal hurt blinds and deafens us some, right? It's someone who's caring and a good listener and might help us to be better listeners and speakers without some of those barbs to it. But because they're not injured at the time, they might be able to be more helpful as an objective witness to that. And there's some value in having, so it may not have to be that's a marriage or a therapy kind of person, but simply having a wise third party can sometimes help people who are stuck get unstuck and hear each other and what they were really trying to say. Here's another way you might have been able to say that. Have you found a time in your life when some kind of wise third-party friend, or it doesn't have to be a professional, really was helpful to you? Has there been a time when someone's asked you to be that kind of person? You know what I'm talking about. Now, Jesus is saying that's a great set of next step to take. And once again, what's the purpose? Because you want to redemption and reconciliation. It's not beating up on someone. It's not saying who was right and wrong. You notice at no point here does he say, and this is the way you'll convince them that you were right all along. It's not about winning the argument or getting your rights. As long as we start out and stay that way, we might as well be arguing about who's the greatest. The point is, it's honest. It's about being honest about where my feelings are, where the bruises have been, all that. But what it's seeking above all else is a genuine restoration of the relationship matters more to me than being right. Somebody might be in a marriage or a friendship tonight. And one of the most difficult parts of it for you is that at least it feels to you that other person always has to win. They always have to be right. The only resolution is you finally giving in and both of you agreeing that he or she is always right, even though that's not the case. As long as this is our posture, it's pretty hard to keep the relationships where they need to be. But it's up, all you can really do is control yourself. Just don't you be that person. As much as it is within you, try not to be that person, because the goal is, I want the relationship back because you matter to me. And that's more important than being right, or who started it, or whatever. That's more important. Sometimes that doesn't work either. You bring in a third party, the counselor, the friend, whatever, and so then what? Well, Jesus said, take it to the church. What does that mean? Maybe it means that you really do call on the larger wisdom of the church to say, am I missing something here? And being open and honest enough to say, what's going on there? It doesn't necessarily mean to have a church town hall business meeting about it, but it does mean even broaden out the circle more. See if the church somehow might be able to be a part of the, redeeming of this. I mean, there's a lot of ways this could sort of show up for us. I mean, imagine that you loaned your lawnmower to your friend Bill, and Bill had the lawnmower for a while, and you thought, sure, I'm happy to loan it to you. He asked to borrow it, and why not? And then it takes a while, and Bill never brought your lawnmower back to you. And you're thinking, hey, Bill, I need my lawnmower back. And then Bill says, you know what? It was sitting in my driveway and somebody ran over it with a car. Man, that's too bad. You're saying, and so you're thinking, well, are you going to pay me for my lawn? And he says, I'm not going to pay you for that. It's just bad luck, but I'm sorry about that. And so you go away and you're all wounded about it. And so then finally you bring 2 or 3 other people maybe from the church, and then he throws you off his property and says, I'm going to call the police on you all. So then what do? Then you bring the whole church, and all 100 of you sheep are out there in front of Bill's house and singing hymns, and you know Bill's not going to come out, so you got signs up, Bill, we love you, come on back, the flock misses you, that kind of stuff. And you see Bill kind of poke through the Venetian blinds and go back up, and then 20 minutes later does it again. Finally, Bill comes out, is all sheepish and gives you a check for the lawnmower, and everybody rejoices, and, isn't that great? I mean, it could happen. It could happen. But Jesus knew that even then, Bill may not come back to the flock. So then what do? Then you have to treat them like a Gentile and a tax collector. Now that might sound like bringing down coals of fire, brimstone, and Gehenna fire on them, but think about it for a minute. What does it mean to treat someone like a Gentile or a tax collector in the Gospel of Matthew? Who's Matthew in the first place? He's a tax collector, right? And he's writing a gospel that's all about how God's going to bring in the Gentiles, starting with those magi, those Gentiles who saw the star, ending up in the very last verse, take this word to the whole gospel, the whole world, and below I'm with you to the very end of the age. So he very much is aware that the Gentiles are these on the outside on the way in. If you treat this person after all of that like a Gentile and a tax collector, Jesus, who was always accused of being a friend of tax collectors and sinners and eating with their own people, it simply means at the end of the day, treat them like a prospect, man. They're never, ever off of your heart. You never check off all the boxes and say, okay, I did everything, so now we're done. No. Now they're a prospect. Now they're someone that you hope against all hope, because you've been a Gentile and a tax collector yourself. Don't you know Matthew loved this part of the story exactly? Treat them like a tax collector. Treat them like a Gentile, which means even more love, even more care. Always making sure you got the light on and the door open for them. Never, ever too late. Because the goal is always to redeem and to restore the relationship. Well, now this got Simon Peter scratching his head because this all sounds good, but boy, this is an awful lot of work, Jesus. And so Peter says, all right, Lord, but how many times do I have to go through this? Because, sometimes when you forgive a person, they do it to you again. Have you noticed that? You ask someone to go out to eat lunch. You get there. You park the car. You sit down. You have some iced tea, some water. You look over the menu 12 times. 30 minutes go by. You finally all embarrassed. You've been stood up. You pay the bill for the iced tea, I guess, and you go back and you say, what happened? Say, oh, no, I forgot. And say, I'm sorry, let's set it again for next week. You say, okay, because you're my buddy, sure. Then you do it next week, and they do it again. Would you ever give them a third shot? You remember the phrase, burn me once, shame on you, burn me twice, shame on me, right? That's not actually in the Bible. It's quoted like it is. It's really not. This is what Simon Peter, God love him. He's always saying what we really wish we could say. Kind of in an episode of Disciples Say the Dumbest kind of things, darndest things, Art Linklater thing. So Simon Peter says, how many times do I have to forgive my brother or sister in the church? How many times, Lord? Because this is exhausting as I'm hearing you tell this story. And then he goes ahead and answers his own question. Don't you love Peter? It's kind of like that, teacher's pet, who asks the question but also answers the question. So how many times? 7? 7 times? And that was actually a pretty good answer, because a lot of people wouldn't forgive anybody even one time. Even in the Jewish law, you did not have to forgive a Gentile if they offended you. On the other hand, in Jewish law, the rabbis said, if it's a fellow Israelite, you should forgive them 3 times. So do it once, shame on you. Do it twice, shame on me. Do it 3 times, still shame on me again. But the 4th time, boy, it's all over. But 3 times. So Peter is taking the rabbis and then more than doubling it. So I'm sure Peter thought he was going to get the gold star, A+, come to the head of the class, Simon Peter, you're my man, by saying 7. He's a super rabbi here, but even coming up with the answer is 7. He probably thought that was a ridiculously high number, because candidly, would any of you forgive the same person for the same thing 7 times? If you're in a marriage, you have, I know, but I mean anybody else? 7 times? And Jesus says, no, not 7 times. 77 times. In your Bible, the one you've got with you, does it say 77 times or does it have another number? Some of you have 70 times 7, right? Is that right? And the reason for the discrepancy is some ancient, of our oldest copies of this text, some of them say 77 and some of them say 70 times 7. It doesn't really matter because both of them are way too many to count, right? So whether it's 490 times or 77 times, the truth is he's taking what Peter thought was a ridiculous number and then multiplying it times super ridiculous. And my hunch would be if it was 490 and you got up to 469, saying, okay, one more time and then it's done. Jesus said, no, I meant 77,000 times 7. I mean, the point is he's saying as long as you're counting, it doesn't count. That's his point. It isn't about counting because the person matters to you more than the offense. And also because if you're wondering how you can forgive like that, when you would way since before that have worn out on your own, he's going to tell a story to Simon Peter, which is what Jesus does. You have to always be careful about a story because it tends to open up on you. But he tells this tricky little story, really, this parable that ends our chapter about forgiveness. It's in response to Peter wanting to get a more limited number, more realistic number of times when I have to usher out this forgiveness. And it's a big deal because, as the Gospel of Matthew is going to say on several occasions, how we relate to each other and how we forgive each other is directly related to our awareness of having been forgiven. The source and the wellspring, that thing that feeds you when you're all out of gas to forgive someone again, is to go back to having been forgiven. Don't ever forget when you were the lost one who got rescued and brought back. Don't ever forget that. Don't ever forget having been forgiven. And it helps us get off our high horse a little bit. So he tells a story about an unforgiving servant or slave. And it's a story full of hyperbole. I think if you were to ask about the humor of Jesus, you don't ever have in the Bible where it says, and Jesus laughed, which it did, but it doesn't. But you do have a lot of humor. Now, it's not late-night comedy humor. Humor in the first century was puns and word plays and hyperbole and things like that. This parable is a classic example of exaggerated speech, hyperbole in a parable. There's so many things about it that are laughingly absurd, but it's Jesus' way of really pushing home a point. Some of the absurdities are this. Somebody owes a king 10,000 talents of money. What was a talent? A talent was equal to 6,000 denarii. That may not help either. But a talent was enough money that a working person would have to work about 24 years to earn a talent of money. So how someone could possibly have racked up a debt of 10,000 talents is boggling. And by the way, that is, in case you're thinking, well, that's nothing for the U.S. government. We do it all the time. But 10,000 talents would be equal to about $1.3 billion in today's money. It would take a regular working person 164,000 years to work off that debt. All right? See how big the debt is? So somehow he got that. I mean, he really maxed out his credit cards to owe that much. And this king, now this is obviously not even in Palestine because they don't have kings who do this. This is imagining a once upon a time Gentile kind of world king, Persia or something. So Jesus is sort of making up the story in that sense, but he imagines that kind of scenario. And this person owes 10,000. And then, of course, he begs, Master, have mercy on me. Just be patient with me, and I'll work and earn and pay it all back. Yeah, 164,000 years. How long you plan to live? He's had to really eat bran cereal a lot to live that long. So no way he's ever going to pay that off. But that's the whole exaggerated speech. It is beyond any wildest imagination that he could ever pay that back. 10,000 talents. Give you a sense of how big that is. The entire imperial tax levied by Rome on all of Palestine was only 600 talents per year. So 600 talents a year was the entire amount that the entire nation owed Rome as the occupying forces tax. 600. This guy owes personally 10,000 talents. It's just ridiculous, right? It's meant to be ridiculous. Just be patient. Like, yeah, right, that's really patient. I'll pay every bit of it back, every last drachma. Yeah, of course. And the amazing thing, of course, here is the king says, okay. Not only I'll wait and let you pay me back, he just simply takes the IOU and tears it up. The guy didn't pay back anything. And the king, who has the authority to do it, I'm sure the finance committee was pretty worried about that, Tom. But anyway, it's just, wow, even for a king, that's a lot to let go. He just lets him off. Of course, you know the story. The guy then, stunned by this, I'm sure, turns and just as he leaves the king's chamber, he sees there someone just happened to be walking by, and he remembers that person owes him 300 denarii. Now, a denarius was, again, the working day's pay of a typical laborer. That's about, a 90-day note or something like that. So it's not that, 100 denarii. So it's like a 3-month amount of time of labor. The guy owes him a fairly modest sum, $1,000, kind of, I guess, in our day. It's some, but it's not much. And the guy has no sooner walked out of the king's presence, having been forgiven 10,000 talents, and he grabs the guy by the throat, which is very graphic. Grabs him by the throat and says, pay me what you owe me. And the guy says, exact same word. You'd think that would have been a ding-ding to the guy's mind that he said 30 seconds ago, but the guy says, please be patient with me, and I will pay you back every last bit. Except in this case, that was realistic. He could have, easily. And the guy will have none of it. In fact, it says he did not will to be patient. It's not that he didn't think of it. He chose not to be patient. And so he said, throw the guy in jail until he pays back every bit. Of course, how do you pay it back if you're in jail? That's the whole thing about debtor's prison. Anybody from Georgia here, the state of Georgia? Georgia was originally a penal colony, a debtor's colony. Australia was that way too, if you're from there. So there are a lot of places where people were just sent kind of as indentured servants to kind of work off a debt. And sometimes they were released when they or their family finally paid back the debt. But it's a pretty tough thing to pay back debts when you're in prison. And yet that's exactly what was going to go on here. And he just throws the guy in jail. Well, needless to say, some other people are watching all that who just saw the scene in the king's courtyard and then saw that out there in the vestibule, and they went and told the king. And the king called the first guy back in, and said, what? After I forgave you an enormity, countless, fathomless debt, you then collar your brother and who could eat, who was so much smaller, and you can't offer what I just gave you? And the king gets really mad about it. Not only does throw him in prison and his whole family, and not only is he thrown in prison, he's tortured. Right? You see that? So it's even got worse. So he went from the frying pan in the fire for sure. And then Jesus says, that's how it'll be. Just when you're thinking, well, he got what he deserved, that record, just when you're about to get onto him and say, yeah, king, go get him. Then Jesus says, that's how it will be for every one of you who does not forgive your brother or sister from your heart. So suddenly you realize that the person in the parable that Jesus is warning us about is that person who was forgiven the enormity and wouldn't pass it on. And do you know what I've learned? I've learned that I'm a lot better at keeping the books on who owes me, not quite so good at keeping up with who I owe. Have you ever figured that out about yourself too? Or am I the only one? Just me? Okay. That blind spot can really be our undoing. But not just between people. The point is, the way I am called to forgive is to remember that I was the servant who was forgiven 10,000 talents. I don't want to ever forget that, Jesus says. It'll change how you relate to others. So in the Lord's Prayer, in the Gospel of Matthew, it would forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. And they're tied together. And he'll comment, that's the one thing he commented on after the Lord's Prayer. Could have done commentary on all of it. But the one thing he says is, because if you don't forgive your brother's sins, neither will you have your sins forgiven. This is really important, because the witness of the church and our right relationship with each other is absolutely dependent on passing along to each other what we all receive so enormously and graciously from a God whose patience and forgiveness and limitless love was so much that we were picked back up when we had no prayer. So how could we do anything other, if we remember that, but to extend these little drops of mercy that we might to each other in the name of and for the joy of and for the glory of our King. The story's prickly because it isn't really about hanging the sword of Damocles over us that, but be careful, you're going to be thrown into hellfire. It's more because if you forgive because you're afraid you're going to get punished, and that's more of a doing a deal. It's rather, I don't want to ever forget being forgiven, and from that, then to forgive. Because you have to do it from the heart, not from the head, not from the calculus. This king may have a soft spot, but he's not soft. He just knew what he was doing and let it go. Even though he'd been wronged, he let it go. And he asks us, invites us, commands us to pass that same thing along. It isn't rational. It is not even just. It flies in the face of justice. It is mercy and patience and love. This agape love. It's not a sloppy agape. It's a hard, faithful giving away what was given. And if we'll do this, and I mean from the heart, not the calculus of the head, but from the heart, Jesus says, our heart will just expand, and the joy of heaven will cascade because one other lost sheep made it back to the flock. And that was what the joy was all about. Let's go away from here, giving away what was given to us. What do you say? Let's pray. Oh Lord, so sometimes in the church we nick each other up. You knew that. You tried to help prepare us. We need to keep going back again and again to the fountain that nourishes us. The reminder that we're the one lost sheep. We are the man forgiven of the enormity of a debt that could never be repaid. We're that guy. We're that sheep. And to remember, because of that we must, how could we do other, but to try to pass that along. And it's especially important because very near to each of us, there's some little one, someone who feels so small and insignificant and worthless and powerless, someone who's an outsider, someone who's a tax collector and a Gentile. And they're the ones most in need of someone who would come looking for them. Having been found, help us go join you to seek and find someone else, that your circle might be widened. In your name we pray. Amen. Thank you, friends. Good night, and we'll see you in 2 weeks.